The world, from of old to our day, is full of stories of stolen children. They are stories of bereavements, sharper than death. From the 1876 memoir of Christian Ross. One summer afternoon in 1874, 5-year-old Walter and his 4-year-old brother Charley were out playing in their front yard in Germantown, an affluent neighborhood in northwest Philadelphia, when 2 men pulled up in a carriage. These men were known to the boys, though not by name, as they'd been by on a few occasions to give them candy. This time, the 2 men offered candy, and something even more enticing, firecrackers. So Walter and Charley hopped into the carriage and were taken across the city. Walter was given 25 cents to go and buy firecrackers inside of a store. But when he exited the shop, the 2 men and Charley had disappeared. The 4-year-old was never seen again. Thus begins one of the most infamous kidnappings in American history. Today we'll learn about Charley's disappearance and the mayhem that ensued, including botched police investigations, conspiracy, political subterfuge, and the river pirate gangs that patrolled the Delaware. This is Jennifer Amell, filling in for your regular missing hosts, pun intended, Tim Polari and Lance Rinstierna. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. The kidnapping of Charley Ross not only predated the infamous Lindbergh baby kidnapping, but garnered equivalent public interest, which is to say, it swept through the nation like a wildfire. It shaped American history and culture, from stranger danger to sinister ransom letters to the modern-day Charley Project, which might be familiar to some listeners. The Charley Project was named after Charley Ross, and it's the internet's largest index of missing persons cases. Since his disappearance, no less than 570 people around the world have claimed to be Charley Ross. For scale, this far surpasses the mere dozens of people who came forward claiming to be Princess Anastasia, who was said to have escaped the massacre of a royal family in Russia. Charley's story and its aftermath is an epic. So to help us understand it, I contacted Carrie Hagen, author of the authoritative book on this case. Carrie Hagen, welcome to Missing. So Carrie is the author of We Is Got 'Em, The Kidnapping That Changed America. Now, Carrie, can you give us some context for how important Charley's case was for America? Like, why even talk about an historical case like this?
Sure. So historians agree in saying that the kidnapping of Charley Ross was the first recorded ransom kidnapping in American history. And I know that's a very big statement, but I found that to be, of course, children had been trafficked and kidnapped, and Philadelphia was a kidnapping ground before the Civil War for free Black children, and slave traders, slave traffickers, were the first major city north of the Mason-Dixon line. The project I'm working on a project now for University of Georgia about Philadelphia's Underground Railroad. And one of the really shocking things for me in researching that has just been how just rampant that battle for the bodies of Black children was then. Charley wasn't the first child kidnapped, but in terms of kidnapping for ransom and certainly receiving the attention that it did, that's the catchphrase that drew me to the story. And the fact that, just spoiler alert right up front, that he was never found, kind of really allowed the story to permeate American folklore and American history. When the book first came out in 2011, I received, just a small flurry of emails. So-and-so told my grandfather that his dad was the missing Charley Ross. I mean, there are little stories like that that I heard a decent amount of, and that the family for years heard a decent amount of. So, it went from this horrible event that captured America's attention 50 years before the Lindbergh baby was taken, to this kind of ongoing, almost, I don't want to use the word whimsical because it was such a tragic event, but the ways in which I've heard about the story, from, this a piece of cut glass to, the mention of Charley Ross almost humorously in folklore songs, that, the saga of what happened to this unfound child became very much a part of American culture for, I would say, that 50-year period.
In 1874, Philadelphia announced that it would be hosting the much-anticipated Centennial Exposition, something that New York City was pretty mad about. The Centennial Exposition was the first World's Fair in commemoration of America's 100th anniversary. It was expected to showcase all the latest from industry to social reform, from the first presentation of the telephone, typewriter, and sewing machine, to a women's pavilion, which was the first international event to showcase the contributions of women, and in support of the suffrage movement. Millions from across the world were expected to attend.
But Philadelphia didn't have enough room to host the crowds that were coming in. So pretty soon, as word is getting out that this little boy is taken, and, the mayor feels some pressure to offer a reward of $20,000 for information leading to the child, and, all of that drama is being built up, he's trying to figure out, how do we take care of this story to get people to come into this city? The city starts asking people through its editorial pages to host strangers during the centennial. There's not enough space. The New York press had already identified that very loudly. So people were being really encouraged to host strangers, at the same time that, the idea of the stranger coming in and preying upon this child. But yeah, at any rate, I think that as the centennial is coming, that creates a huge, massive public, PR nightmare for the mayor and his people. And everything was, in some ways, power, money was smaller and more connected. And there was this group of advisors that the mayor had that included a newspaper publisher. And he would definitely, the newspapers talk about how he answered to them, and this group of men would get around and kind of, talk about how to handle Charley Ross.
A few hours after being left outside the fireworks store, a kindly stranger found Walter Ross crying on the street corner. This stranger brought Walter back to his home at East Washington Lane in Germantown. Christian Ross, Walter and Charley's father, tells of the moment when he found out Charley was missing in his memoir, A Father's Story. At about 8 p.m. that evening, as Christian was preparing to go alert the police, he saw Walter walking down Main Street in the company of a Mr. Peacock. Quote, "When we joined them, I asked Walter where he had been. The child was so much frightened that he could not reply. Mr. Peacock answered for him that he had found him in Kensington. I then asked Walter where Charley was. He answered, 'Why, he's all right. He's in the wagon,' supposing that he himself was the lost one, and not doubting that Charley would be brought back." End quote. Christian went on to the police station and informed them that Charley was missing, and told authorities Walter's story.
In so many ways, the police acted, again, it was a young force, but, at the time, police officers were still, in the beginning, they were still working on the side, a lot of them as private investigators. So there was definitely corruption. There was definitely a stomping ground, a territorial feuding between who was in charge of the story and who wasn't in charge of the story. So in that sense, I feel like the story of Charley Ross definitely calls attention to a city at a time when it was really becoming defined as a city. I mean, America, is getting ready to enter into the second century, and Philadelphia, at the same time that Charley Ross was taken, the very day the mayor finds out that this little boy was taken, and that there's there's a kidnapper involved and the newspapers are being used, he is getting ready to, or he is announcing that the city's welcoming the Centennial Exposition. And he's, getting ready to try to figure out ways to draw all kinds of attention to Philadelphia and to welcome tourists to Philadelphia. So, people know Philadelphia's iconic City Hall, right? The building that for years was the highest point in the city was the Statue of William Penn, right? And the cornerstone of that building was laid the very same day that, the lost advertisement for Charley Ross hit the newspaper. So in the cornerstone of City Hall, it just so happens that there's a newspaper from that day when it was dedicated that saying this child was missing.
Christian's wife, Sophie Ross, had been in poor health and had taken the eldest children to Atlantic City for a few weeks for a summer vacation. For this reason, Christian didn't want any mention of Charley's disappearance in the papers, hoping to recover him before she returned and not wishing to cause her, quote, undue alarm. After searching all night, Christian woke his son Walter around 7 a.m. Here's what he writes, quote, I awakened Walter and refrained from saying anything to him about his adventure of the preceding day until he had his breakfast. He was pale and nervous, not having wholly recovered from his fright. The story that Walter told was that two men driving on the lane in a buggy had given him and his brother Charley candy on Saturday, June 27th, Monday, June 29th, Tuesday, June 30th, and Wednesday, July 1st. And that Charley had asked them for a ride, and also whether they would not buy him firecrackers, which they promised to do. After driving to the top of the hill, they turned around and took them into the wagon. Walter asked them to go to the main street to get the firecrackers. To this request, the men said, No, we will take you to Aunt Susie's, a fictitious person, who keeps a store and will give you a pocketful for 5 cents. He said Charley was placed on the seat between the men, and he sat on the knee of the one who was not driving. He also said that the men talked to them as they drove along, but said more to Charley than to him, that they did not talk much to each other. About all he remembered their saying was that the one on whose knee he sat took off his hat and, showing it to his companion, remarked that it was about worn out and that he would have to get another one. End quote. The rest of Walter's story remains unchanged. They reached Palmer and Richmond streets, and he was given money to buy some firecrackers. When he exited the store, the men and Charley were gone, and this was confirmed by a little girl who witnessed the two men give Walter money. This little girl also saw the men drive up Palmer Street to the first small street, then turn the corner, and disappear in an easterly direction. Walter also mentioned that the two men shared a tincture of liquor and water between them, stopping periodically to add more water from public taps. Walter went on to describe the appearance of the men. The driver was medium-sized, about 5'9", quote, rather full and red in the face, and with a red or sandy mustache, and no beard, eyeglasses, and an open-faced gold watch, gold vest chain, and green sleeve buttons. The other man Walter described as, quote, older, taller, and heavier than the driver. He had whiskers about 3 inches long, of a red or sandy color, and a nose which was turned up or in some way deformed. He wore gold-bowed spectacles and 2 gold rings on one of his middle fingers, one plain and the other set with a red stone. End quote. The police told Christian that they believed the two men had taken Charley because they were drunk. Once they had sobered up and realized what they had done, the police theorized, Charley would turn up. This was not comforting to Christian Ross. Detectives went on to question Christian about the kidnapper's possible motives. Christian couldn't think of anyone who wanted to harm him or his family. Later speculation for the targeting of Charley Ross is that he lived in an affluent neighborhood, and perhaps the kidnappers thought the Rosses had money. But it turns out they didn't, and Christian was in a lot of debt due to the stock market crash of 1873. Then Christian got word that a, quote, band of gypsies were breaking camp and were passing down Germantown Lane. Someone saw a little boy in their company who was crying. They assumed the child did not belong to that group, and they thought that it might just be Charley Ross. It's important to mention that so-called gypsies could have meant any kind of nomadic people, from Romanis to Mexicans to Hungarians. Gypsy is a derogatory term for those groups, and the stereotype around them is that they were a group engaged in criminal activity and routinely stole children. So, to Christian's 19th century understanding, this tip could have proven true. 3 officers were dispatched and approached this group and made a thorough search of their caravan, but no trace of Charley, or of any children for that matter, were found. That same day, Christian decided to print several advertisements promising a $300 reward for Charley's safe return. All Christian could do was sit back and wait for some kind of result. While he waited, he went to the central police station. That day, Christian's brother came bursting inside, waving an envelope in the air. It was postmarked Philadelphia, July the 3rd, 8 a.m. It read, in unruly black ink, the following, quote, Mr. Ross, be not uneasy. You son Charley Brewster will be all writ. We has got him, and no powers on earth can deliver out of your hand. You will have to pay us before you get him from us, and pay us a big cent too. If you put the cops hunting for him, you is only defeating your own end. We has got him. Put so no living power can get him from us alive. If any approach is made to his hiding place, that is the signal for his instant annihilation. If you regard his life puts no one to search for him, you money can fesh him out alive, and no other existent powers. Don't deceive yourself, and think the detectives can get him from us, for that is impossible. You hear from us in few day. End quote.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
It's hard to overstate the absolute chill this sent through not only the Ross family, but the larger community of Philadelphia. Christian Ross writes, quote, so overwhelming was the astonishment and indignation that for a time everyone was silent. The disguised writing, the evident effort at bad spelling, the absence of the fact that my child had been taken away for money, indicated that the wretch who designed the plot and carefully prepared to guard himself and his vile accomplices from detection.
Tell us about those ransom letters. How are they distinct?
It is, and they really offer a window into this kind of 19th century criminal psychology in a way. They're very eerie. They vary in length. They're eerie. At times they use poetic metaphor and this kind of sing-song quality. When you compare the handwriting between the letters, sometimes words are spelled incorrectly, sometimes they're not. But they span, a couple of months from when they begin and when they end. And that's how we have the 23 and a half, as they say.
That's wild. That's the piece of the story that makes it mythical to me. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way in which they're written, but yeah, it does lend this haunting quality to the story. I mean, despite the fact that it's a kidnapped child we're talking about.
It looks like, so when we think about ransom letters now, and what we see on TV, right? Because that's where most of us, have experience looking at other ones, what we see on the crime shows. We'll see the cutout words put together. There's something horrific about the Joker-esque kind of quality to how they're presented as the person's trying to disguise their identity. These kidnappers are too, but you can definitely tell in looking at them that it's like the person who won't shut up. Like, just say what you have to say in a sentence or two and be done with it. That's going to be freaky enough, right? But they go on and on and on. It's almost just like this unraveling. And, you wonder, they're creating a character of themselves. There's some kind of failed something at play in the way that these are written, because, the family's not releasing them to the press. The only people reading them, we have the family and we have the police officers, and they want the money. So why the long prose? And I don't know, on my website, I have an image or two of them, but you can see in the book, here's one of them, like letter 10. We're talking 2-page, like that's the font we're looking at. For just the length, they're very long, some of them.
It's almost theatrical.
Very theatrical. And they come from July, and they come during a very short period of time. So we go from July of 1874, and I believe the last one is written in September, October. They go until November 6th, and then they stop. And that's right around the time that the mother and her brothers have arranged a hotel meetup that is botched.
Christian went on to say that he was sure the letter had come from Charley's real kidnappers, because they had correctly said Charley's middle name, Brewster. Now, no one really called him Brewster, except Walter on occasion. And Walter remembered calling Charley Brewster while on that carriage ride with the kidnappers. This was the first known, or at least well-publicized, kidnapping for Ransom. And this letter, along with up to 23 more letters from the kidnappers, infused or created the mythos of ransom letters, such as purposely disguised handwriting and spelling. And now, knowing that Charley was kidnapped, the police redirected their investigation. They deployed a massive manhunt, searching every vessel in the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, all vehicles crossing the bridges, all railroad depots, and even abandoned houses and barns. Even some wealthy friends of the Ross family hired the Pinkertons, a fabled detective agency. Nothing, however, was found of Charley Ross. But then on July 6th, a second letter arrived from the kidnappers, demanding a $20,000 ransom, but also promising that Charley had not been harmed. Christian was floored. $20,000 then would be about $500,000 today. It was an impossible sum. Christian was instructed by authorities not to even try negotiating with the kidnappers, as their correspondence thus far had been published in the local paper, and they didn't really want the public to know what was going on. Even if they managed to agree on a reasonable ransom, how would they exchange the money for the child? It came down to a question of logistics. One newspaper correspondent came up with what's known as the bridge story, where Christian would find a bridge on a flat land somewhere, and through a ridiculous setup of a series of code phrases to 3 of the kidnappers' henchmen, would deliver the money and just, hope that they'd honor the exchange and give him Charley. One other guy all the way in California suggested that Mr. Ross hollow out some large logs and place them under the bridge, in which the police would hide and then jump out and shoot the kidnappers once Charley was secured. Meanwhile, and understandably, Christian decided to try and raise the ransom money anyway. After a few correspondences with the kidnappers, they suggested Christian deliver the full amount and wait 5 hours for them to release Charley. They also threatened that if Christian didn't give them all the $20,000 or tried to trick them in any way, they would kill Charley. They required that the money be delivered in bills, no larger than $10 denominations, so that the notes couldn't be traced by the banking system. Still, the problem remained that the Ross family simply didn't have that kind of money. One evening, a gentleman rang the bell. He was unknown to the Ross family, but he was invited in, and he proceeded to ask about all the details surrounding Charley's disappearance. He said to Christian, quote, "Do you wish to pay the ransom and run the risk of getting the child in 5 hours? If you do, I will give you $20,000 and never ask you to return 1 cent." End quote. Christian wrote in his memoirs that he felt overwhelmed by this generosity and that he could not accept it. The gentleman, however, decided to ask his wife, whom by now was back from Atlantic City and sick with worry. Mrs. Ross, said her husband, would, quote, make almost any sacrifice to get her child back, as any mother would do. They decided to accept. Great exigencies, wrote Christian, bring out great virtues. This great crime thus brought out this generous offer.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor. Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
2 weeks had now passed since Charley's kidnapping. The public was in an uproar, and many started to blame the police. Others saw that all the intensive search efforts had amounted to nothing, and started to concoct conspiracy theories. Not much has changed in modern missing persons cases. One letter addressed to the chief of police went something like this, quote, "Has it ever occurred to you that the Ross boy was stolen by his own father? Signed, $20,000, end quote. Many other false leads came in by way of personals published in the paper. There were some letters to police, and even to the mayor of Philadelphia. Around the same time, another letter arrived from the kidnappers. By the language, it seemed like Charley was no longer being held by the original kidnappers, but at a different location and with different people. They said that Charley, quote, wants to come home to Walter, and that he is afraid he will not get home in time to go to Atlantic City to be with his mother when Sophie comes back, end quote. It was decided that 3 days from then, on Saturday, they would make the exchange. The 3 intervening days, wrote Christian, were spent in nervous anxiety. I felt that it was a fearful risk involving the life of the child, and in painful agony the hours were passed. The terrible threats, enforced by the dreadful blasphemies, caused me to feel that the life of our little boy was hanging by a single hair, end quote. Saturday came and went, and Christian did not hear from the kidnappers. Arrangements were made, however, that police would hide themselves at the Ross house and be prepared to arrest anyone who would come to collect the ransom money. What ensued in the following weeks was a series of attempts to exchange money for the child, but none of them worked. No one could figure out how to ensure Charley's safety, not spook the kidnappers, and clandestinely set a trap for them so they couldn't get away. This all came to a head later that year, on the night of December 13th, in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. A judge's home was broken into, but the judge's brother actually lived next door and saw that a commotion was going on, so he armed himself and his sons, and the family set out to thwart the burglary. And then in a hail of gunfire, the 2 robbers were shot. Their names were Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas. Mosher was killed at the judge's house, but Douglas managed to live for a few hours and communicate some last words. With his dying breath, Joe Douglas confessed that it was he and Mosher who had kidnapped Charley Ross. There's no consensus on what Douglas's actual words were, but some say that he said Charley had been killed, and others say that Mosher knew where the boy was being hidden and that he was still alive. Then, Joe Douglas died. Days later, Walter Ross, still only 5 years old, was taken to New York to see Mosher and Douglas's bodies, to see if they matched the guys who had taken him and Charley on that carriage ride. Walter confirmed that it was them. And listen, I wouldn't put too much stock in the word of a 5-year-old, but remember one of the men Walter described had a deformed nose? Well, the cartilage of Bill Mosher's nose had been eaten away by some disease, like syphilis or cancer. Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas were career criminals and known as river pirates. For about a decade from the 1860s, the Hudson River in New York was crawling with gangs of river pirates. Mostly these pirates would steal goods and cargo from other vessels on the water. They were pretty well organized and usually were made up of Irish immigrants. Among the most notorious of these river pirate groups were the Charlton Street Gang, Hook Gang, and the Patsy Conroys. And just to note, because it's kind of awesome, the Charlton Street Gang was led by a female pirate called Sadie the Goat, who flew the Jolly Roger and made people walk the plank. But after Sadie the Goat led a raid that escalated to murder in the Hudson Valley, the Charlton Street Gang were targeted by local vigilantes and taken down, and the NYPD eventually cracked down on river piracy by organizing the Steamboat Squad, which patrolled the waters and arrested pirates. So Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas must have left their gang in the Hudson in favor of bigger money on the Delaware. According to an accomplice, William Westervelt, who later stood trial for being complicit in Charley Ross's abduction, said that Mosher was obsessed with kidnapping the child of a wealthy family for ransom. He wanted to go after a Vanderbilt child, but settled on Charley Ross instead because he lived in a big house in Germantown. Now, the fact that Mosher and Douglas were Charley's abductors is not really disputed, but Charley himself was never located. Christian Ross and his wife Sophie never gave up, and they died not knowing what had happened to their son. But the story doesn't necessarily stop there. Decades later, in 1934, a 69-year-old carpenter in Phoenix, Arizona, named Gustav Blair, petitioned the court to legally recognize him as Charley Ross. Gustav's story was that he was kidnapped in Philadelphia by Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas. Then he lived in a cave for some reason, and then was given to a man who eventually adopted him and told him his real identity. Charley's older brother, Walter, dismissed Gustav Blair, saying that, quote, "The idea that my brother is still alive is not only absurd, but the man's story seems unconvincing. We've long given up hope that Charles would ever be found alive." End quote. Gustav's claim in court, however, went uncontested, and the Maricopa County courts had to rule that he was Charles Brewster Ross in 1939. So Gustav is legally Charley Ross. The Ross family, however, refused to recognize him and didn't grant him any legal claim to property or inheritance. He died in 1943, still claiming to be the lost Charley Ross. And this would be heartbreaking if in fact Gustav was Charley, that someone could come forward, tell the truth, and not be believed. But in 2011, DNA testing was done to try and match Gustav's DNA to his adopted family. When the results came back, the tests proved that Gustav was not Charley Ross. Gustave was not adopted, and in fact, belonged to the Miller family. Despite an investigation that carried on for over a century, still, the mystery of Charley Ross's disappearance was never solved. There's echoes of Charley's story in every missing child case. It's touched every point of American crime culture. A lot of people who have studied missing persons cases speculate that if Bill Mosher and Joe Douglas actually did kidnap Charley, they likely killed him after a couple days. It's hard to believe that they would have spent the money to care for a child for that long, or even that he was given to responsible adoptive parents. I like to think that because he was so young, Charley didn't really remember his original family. I like to think he was given to someone kind and lived out a good life. But I guess we'll never know. I'm going to play us out with a little tune you heard at the beginning of this episode. It was composed by Dexter Smith and W.H. Brockway, and it's entitled Bring Back Our Darling. And it was written about Charley Ross's disappearance. Unfortunately, I can't really sing, but it has some really lovely and sad lyrics. So I'll post a link, and if you're interested, you can read the lyrics yourself. I hope you enjoy. Carrie Hagen is the author of We Is Got 'Em, a nonfiction book about the disappearance of Charley Ross. It's only available in ebook format currently, but can be ordered through Amazon. I think there's some used copies you can get on there too. And then Carrie's fiction debut came out in 2022, called The Muralist, of Matter, Deep and Dangerous, set in her beloved Philadelphia, where she still lives with her family. Please find links in the show notes. Please find the links in the show notes.